It is looked upon as favorable in our community to give our time and our money to help others in need. While I agree with this sentiment, I want to make people aware of a dark side of volunteerism, when our actions and intentions can actually cause harm to people or communities. I want people to be aware of the real long-term effects of our actions, not just the short-term personal satisfaction they feel when they think they've helped someone. What if I told you that each year, millions of people jeopardize the progress of a developing country? While this statistic sounds extreme, it is the reality that many developing countries have to face daily. And this problem has a root: the white savior complex. The white savior complex is demonstrated when affluent people travel to a new country in order to save the local people who live there. Oftentimes, these volunteers pay thousands of dollars in order to go on this trip. And whether it be for religious, personal, or educational reasons, these philanthropists usually do believe they are making a difference. They have good intentions. The problem arises from the volunteers' preparation and mindset. They go into the country thinking that they know best, that it is their job to save the country. They think, if I don't do it, who will? While we praise this mindset as noble, there are many underlying consequences of this way of thinking that I will address throughout this talk. To begin, it is no sole person's job to save a country, let alone one he does not even live in. When people come into these communities with this savior mindset, it is damaging to the community because people are not given the ability to speak up, and the local people who have lived in the community their whole life feel that they cannot say anything and that their opinion does not matter. Additionally, because this volunteer has probably not spent a lot of time in the local community and has not done thorough research, he cannot be sure if his solution will be sustainable. Oftentimes, these volunteers come into countries trying to make them more modern or Americanized, but this may not necessarily be what is best for the community. So knowing this, how can we apply it to our daily volunteering? First, it is important to consider the credibility of an organization. How are they going to spend the money and/or time you give them? In one example, according to Reader's Digest, the organization Cancer Fund of America only spent 3% of the donations they received on direct aid. The other 97% went to the personal needs of the staff, primarily the founder. In fact, there is no federal law that prohibits a charity from lying to consumers to get money. Secondly, how are your unique set of skills going to be useful to a project? If you're an engineer, build a house. If you're a teacher, work in an English classroom. And if you're a doctor, work in a medical clinic. But what happens when a teacher finds herself on construction duty and an engineer is now surrounded by kindergartners? It seems pretty obvious that this might not be the best solution. However, it is often the sad reality of how these organizations work. As long as they have volunteers paying them, they do not care where they are placed. As high schoolers, this aspect applies to us the most. We want to create meaningful change, but it is important that we are able to be honest with ourselves and others about our lack of qualifications and experience. One piece of advice I have is to create a list of the skills you do have and then compare them to a list of what the organization needs, keeping in mind that your skills are usually more transferable to local projects. Pippa Biddle, an author and advocate against the white savior complex, went on one of these service trips to Tanzania in high school. While she was there, she and her classmates would build libraries during the day, and while they were asleep at night, the local men in the village would tear down their progress. The people in the class woke up the next morning till the libraries built again by the men in the village. The men in the village had to do twice the normal amount of work because these girls were not qualified to build libraries. They had no previous construction experience, and they were doing this just to keep the girls happy. So before you go to do something abroad, think about the local people in the community who would be paid to do the same. Think of it this way. How many of you are taught to never give money to a homeless person, but instead offer them food? There's thought that goes into this action. People consider the negative effects of simply handing over cash, such as aiding drug or alcohol addictions, and instead came up with a beneficial solution. So why can't we put this much effort into every act of kindness we produce? The short answer is we can. However, it takes organizations and people to be honest with their actions and intentions, to admit their shortcomings. I had the privilege of being able to interview Pippa Biddle on this topic. When I asked her why it was so hard for us to acknowledge that this complex exists, she said, similar to the discomfort we feel around having to admit something's wrong, there's a very large amount of discomfort for people around admitting when they have privilege, especially when that privilege comes from things they can't control. While this may feel uncomfortable, it is the only way that we can combat this issue. When I was brainstorming for this talk, I considered taking the white out of the title, only calling it the savior complex. While this mindset can apply to anyone, it truly is a problem with privilege, especially white privilege. And Biddle helped me understand this. She shared, with privilege that's racial, there is a clear way you can tell someone to try to balance that scale, because they can't get rid of their race. They can't give away race in the same way they can give away money. In our society, if someone is wealthy, they're able to donate money to a charity. But this is where the white savior complex stems from. Not being able to get rid of your privilege, not being able to make up for it, and not being able to balance that scale. When local communities are not given the ability to learn from their own mistakes, they can develop a mindset that is very harmful. There's a term called an external locus of control, which refers to a person believing that the events of the universe are outside of his control, and he has developed learned helplessness. And helplessness, just like the name suggests, is learned. It is reinforced when people are not given the ability to fix their own problems, come up with their own solutions. So when saviors come into this country, even when they are extremely qualified and provide aid just doing everything for the country, they're not giving the locals the ability to learn from their own mistakes. They're moving the country farther away from achieving self-sufficiency. But what happens when there's no longer aid? What happens when these volunteers go home after a couple of days or weeks? The constant rotation of volunteers is harming to any community, but vastly destructive to orphanages. People go to orphanages when they're on vacation and walk in off the street for a day or a week to play with the children there. However, what most people don't know is how corrupt these organizations are. In fact, 80% of the children living in orphanages aren't actually orphans. They have more than one, or they have at least one living parent. So where are these children coming from? Sometimes they are trafficked, taken from their families, and other times the families willingly give up their children, hoping they will receive a better life and education. But what these people don't know are that conditions in orphanages are far from nurturing. Many times when you walk into an orphanage as a volunteer, you will see a room that looks something like this. It is very compact, there's not a lot of space, and there aren't a lot of material possessions. However, conditions are kept like this on purpose. Owners of the organizations know that when you see a room that looks like this, you feel an immense amount of sympathy. And that sympathy leads to you wanting to do something about it. You create a GoFundMe or a campaign to raise money and donations. But the donations you raise will not go to help these children. This condition that you see here will not change. Those donations are taken by the owner and pocketed for his own personal needs. And by donating to places like this, you are promoting that cycle. Volunteers donate and they keep conditions the same, or even worse, to elicit more donations. So as long as we don't donate our time and instead as long as we don't donate money and instead donate our time, this kind of volunteering is fine, right? Not exactly. In fact, Australia has recently considered orphanage tourism a kind of modern slavery. Just as not everyone is qualified to work in an English classroom or build a house, not everyone is qualified to work with these vulnerable children. People who are volunteering in these orphanages should be people who are trained professionals and have experience with this issue. Additionally, because many volunteers come in straight off the street, they're not subjected to background checks. And sometimes volunteers are pedophiles looking for easy targets. In one instance, Al Jazeera journalists recently went undercover and were able to walk in off the street with no identification or paperwork to take 4 orphans out of an orphanage in Cambodia for the night. Not only are these children subjected to horrible physical abuse like this, but a lot of emotional abuse as well. The constant rotation of volunteers causes these children to develop attachment disorders. The orphans were already abandoned before when they were placed in the orphanage initially. And then with a new cycle of volunteers coming in every day or every week, these children fall in love with them only to be abandoned once more. And these attachment disorders have lasting effects. They can make it very difficult for a child to trust or be in a relationship later in life. So how can we stop orphanage tourism, as well as change the mindset we have while volunteering? The good news is you've already started the first step, learning about the issue. When you take the time to research an organization, you are more likely to discover if it has negative intentions. And by research, I don't just mean looking at the organization's website, as this will only show you the positive aspects. Instead, take the time to look for personal reports or critiques against the organization. Secondly, after your research, the best thing you can do is simply acknowledging that this complex exists and actively trying to change it. Biddle said when I asked her what was one thing she wished more children knew, if they don't have the time to learn about a place and learn about an issue, why do they think that they have the right to try to solve it or to go there? As high schoolers, we love to volunteer, but if we're not going to take 5 minutes to look up maybe what the capital of the country is we're going to, there's no reason why we should be trusted to go volunteer in that country. And people love to volunteer. It causes a chemical reaction in our body which makes us feel good. I am by no means saying volunteering is bad. I love to volunteer, and I believe that it is good. However, I do think it is important that we evaluate our qualifications, do our research, and not justify our vacation by adding on the word volunteering. Biddle suggests that we can sit down and write a list of what our goals are, and then seriously evaluate if those goals need to be fulfilled through volunteering, which we can do locally in that case. I know many of us are in a time and a place where the importance of volunteering is stressed to us as a necessary part of our college application. However, despite that pressure, there's a time and a place to volunteer. So do your research, find something you are truly passionate about, and don't volunteer just to volunteer. Don't volunteer just to simply check off another box on your application. Volunteer for the right reasons. Thank you.